Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unraveling the mechanics behind surviving the truly impossible. I am so excited to guide you through this because we're going to look at some of the most jaw-dropping, statistically absurd survival stories ever recorded. We'll be breaking down the exact science, the split-second decisions, and the sheer environmental anomalies that somehow kept these people alive when absolutely everything else pointed to certain disaster. Okay. Let's dive into this by starting with a terrifying, incredibly high-stakes scenario. I want you to imagine plummeting toward the Earth at 120 miles per hour, pulling your cord, and suddenly realizing your parachute just isn't going to open. This is exactly what happened to an experienced skydiver on her 35th jump. I mean, it's a nightmare most of us can't even fathom, right? How could anyone possibly walk away from that? Well, hold that thought, because the answer involves a really bizarre biological twist. And we're going to break down exactly how she survived it a little bit later in this explainer.
Chapter 1. Man versus Machine. Let's look at some mechanical hazards. You know, in these types of scenarios, the margins of survival are completely microscopic. Take Tiba, for example. She was a young Indian girl who wandered into a really risky construction site filled with debris. While she was exploring, she tripped and fell neck first right onto a long metal rod protruding from a brick. Now, it sounds like an absolute tragedy for sure, but when she was rushed to the hospital, doctors were absolutely stunned. Somehow, the metal rod had miraculously missed all of the vital nerves and blood vessels in her head. After just a 35-minute surgery, it was removed and she was actually discharged 3 days later. If she had fallen just a few millimeters further forward, she wouldn't have made it. That is the literal definition of a microscopic margin of survival.
5 inches. That was the size of the opening at a factory where a worker named Matthew Lowe was just walking past an automated conveyor belt for a routine shift. Totally without warning, his overalls snagged on the machine. And before he could even react, the belt pulled him in and dragged his entire body through that impossibly narrow 5-inch tunnel. The trauma his body endured here was just catastrophic. His coworkers literally heard his bones cracking as the machine finally spat him out on the other side. And incredibly, he was still conscious. His back was broken in 2 places, his pelvis, ribs, and hips were practically crushed, alongside severe abdominal tears. Doctors had very little hope, and they even told his partner to prepare for the worst. But against all odds, after 6 surgeries and a full month in the hospital, Matthew survived. Even more amazingly, he made a full recovery after 18 months and actually went back to work.
And hey, if you think that's surreal, take the story of Stephen McCormack. He's an experienced truck driver from New Zealand who slipped and fell while working between his truck's bumper and the trailer. He fell directly onto the brass valve that supplies compressed air to the truck's brakes. The valve actually punctured him, and highly pressurized air began violently forcing its way into his body. His fat tissue was literally being separated from his muscle. He started inflating like a balloon, nearly doubling in size, with air filling the spaces around his lungs, his heart, and, get this, even behind his eyelids? Because ambulances were busy, he had to wait an entire hour in this state. Doctors eventually had to insert a tube through his ribs just to help him breathe, and it took 3 days for the trapped air to naturally expel. If that valve had hit a blood vessel, he absolutely would not have made it.
Chapter 2. Swallowed by Nature. Wild Encounters.
So we're moving away from the cold, hard steel of machines into the unpredictable wild, where animals inadvertently become either the deadly threat or the bizarre savior. A bait ball, for context, is a tightly packed swarm of fish. Kayakers Julie McSorley and Liz Cottrell were out in San Luis Obispo, California, really just hoping to watch some humpback whales feed. Now, experts strongly recommend staying at least 300 feet away from feeding zones, but Julie and Liz unfortunately misjudged the safety zone. Suddenly, a massive bait ball moved right next to them. A 56-foot humpback whale lunged forward to swallow the fish, and in the process accidentally scooped up both women, trapping them entirely inside its massive mouth. So the absolutely crucial points here is exactly how they survived being swallowed alive, and it all comes down to pure anatomy. While a humpback's mouth is massive, I mean, it can easily fit a kayak, their throat size is actually tiny. It's only about the size of a human fist and stretches to a maximum of maybe 15 inches in diameter. On top of that, they don't have teeth, so the women weren't crushed. Because it was physically impossible to actually swallow them, the whale's natural instinct kicked in to just spit out anything that wasn't a fish. Moments later, the 2 women were spat right back out to the surface, completely unharmed.
All right, let's revisit that opening hook. We talked about a skydiver falling at 120 miles per hour. Well, this is Joan Murray. After her main parachute completely failed, she deployed her reserve, but she started spinning uncontrollably, which tangled the cords into a useless knot. She crashed into the ground at 80 miles per hour, hearing a loud crack before losing consciousness. So how on earth you survive an 80-mile-per-hour freefall?
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the medical marvel that actually saved her. The entire right side of Joan's body was crushed, and she immediately fell into a coma. But she didn't just land on the bare ground. By pure, inexplicable chance, she landed directly on top of a massive fire ant nest.
200. While she was lying there completely crushed and unconscious, Joan was swarmed by the disturbed insects and stung over 200 times. I know, it sounds like an awful added layer of torture, but it was actually her salvation.
Here's the exact science behind it. Fire ants produce a venom called solanopsin, which heavily stimulates the nervous system. Because she was injected with an overwhelming amount of this venom, it essentially acted like a massive adrenaline shot that shocked her entire system. This extreme chemical stimulation literally kept her heart beating inside her crushed body just long enough for paramedics to finally arrive. She underwent multiple reconstructive surgeries and, incredibly, woke up from her coma 2 weeks later to make a full recovery. Nature literally shocked her back to life. Chapter 3: The Smokestack Miracle, aboard the RMS Lusitania in 1915.
This whole sequence of events is just pure chaos. Margaret Geer was a young newlywed on the ship when it was suddenly torpedoed by a German submarine. In the sheer panic, she managed to make it to a lifeboat. But looking up at the sinking ship's massive smokestacks, she became terrified they were going to collapse directly onto her. So she actually climbed out and went back up to the main deck while her husband stayed behind in a different boat. As the massive ship submerged, a whirlpool formed, sucking Margaret and 2 other men down deep inside one of those very smokestacks. It absolutely should have been the end, but miraculously, a massive internal explosion from the ship's boilers suddenly blasted her right back up through the smokestack and up to the surface. She was pulled into a nearby lifeboat, only to look over and see her husband crying, completely convinced she had just died. Chapter 4: The Luckiest Unlucky Man. Meet Frane Selak.
Frane Selak is a man whose life basically defies any standard statistical model you could throw at it. He stared death in the face not once, not twice, but 7 times. Let's map out his first 3 unbelievable survivals, which all happened on public transit. In 1962, his train derailed and plunged into a freezing river. Most passengers died or drowned, but he swam to shore with just a broken arm. 1 year later, in 1963, he was on a small commuter plane when the engines failed. A malfunctioning door blew completely open, and Frane was sucked out into a mid-air freefall with no parachute. The plane crashed, tragically killing all 19 people on board. But Frane? He landed squarely on a haystack and escaped with minor injuries. Fast forward 2 years to 1965. His bus crashed through a bridge into a valley. 4 people died. Frane survived again.
And this brilliantly illustrates why you shouldn't just assume switching transit methods solves your problems. Frane figured he'd rely on his own car, but in 1970, the engine caught fire while driving and he barely jumped out in time. In 1973, a ruptured fuel pump blew actual fire directly through his air conditioning vents. In 1975, he was hit by a bus while he was just walking down the street. And finally, in 1976, a careless driver forced him off a mountain road. His car plummeted 300 feet, exploding right on impact. So, how did he survive that one? He literally jumped out of the car's window mid-fall and landed safely in a tree on the side of the cliff. I mean, you really just can't make this stuff up. After a lifetime of freezing rivers, fiery explosions, and literally falling out of the sky without a parachute, Frane Selak actually won the lottery in 2003. It is the ultimate statistically impossible punchline to an absolutely absurd life. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. When a woman is saved by a 200-bite venom injection, or a guy falls out of an airplane into a perfectly placed haystack, is survival really just a random roll of the dice? Or is there a strange hidden science to what we casually call luck, where physics, biology, and timing all just magically align in the most extreme statistical anomalies possible? Thank you so much for joining me to explore these incredible facts. Keep questioning the impossible, and I'll catch you next time.